Welcome to the first Bridwell Institute for Economic Freedom public event we've ever had. My name is, by the way, Robert Lawson. So this is our first real Bridwell Institute event, though, and so it's great to finally be out and about. By pure coincidence, it turns out that our last event, when we were still the O'Neill Center, February of 2020, also featured tonight's speaker. He had another speaker that night, and the other speaker that night was vastly better than Ben, but we had a really good event in February, and then of course everything sort of came to an end. So this is our first time back, and Ben's back with us. So our talk tonight is about Ben's new book. Ben Powell, the director of the Free Market Institute at Texas Tech University. He has a new book with Alex Novrasta called Wretched Refuse, The Political Economy of Immigration and Institutions. When the book came out, I told our people, I said, this is an important book. It's a scholarly book. You're going to see regression tables, which is terrifying. No one wants to see regression tables after 5 o'clock in the evening, I know. But it's a very important book. It talks to a very important topic. And Ben has brought, I think, the best scholarship to this question of how immigrants affect our country I think that exists. I can give you a longer bio, but you have Google. Ben is a professor, as I said, at Texas Tech University. He was educated at University of Massachusetts Lowell and George Mason University. He taught at San Jose State University and Suffolk University before he finally got to Texas. Ben, take it away.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. I'm thrilled to be with you all here tonight for multiple reasons. One, yes, bookending the O'Neill Center and the Bridwell Institute is fantastic. And I love Tucker Bridwell, so that's even better. But also, I haven't been getting out as much on public speaking circuits. It turns out most universities in this country are kind of closed for public speaking events. So I'm thrilled to be here for your first in-person event this year. And I'm also particularly happy to be able to present this new book to you, which, as Bob alluded to, I have a better co-author on than I did in my last book, Alex Novrasta. It was really fun talking about Socialism Sucks here. Actually, I love giving that book talk way more because then I have a stage reason to have a beer under the podium and get to drink a beer during my talk. I have no such reason to do that on this book. So I guess I don't get to do that tonight. But I do think what we're in this book, so both in what Bob and I were doing in that book, it was playful and fun and trying to reach a new audience, but on a hugely important question about institutions that order economic activity in societies. I think this is a really important question too, and it's about how immigrants impact institutions when they come to other countries. And I'm going to describe, I have other immigration talks that I'll do to public audiences, with public audiences that talk about different impacts that they might have on the economy. And it can involve concerns about jobs, wages, the welfare state, fiscal impact, things like that. But I actually really think, one, the social science on what those questions, the answers to those questions versus what the public believes. A lot of the social science isn't that big a debate on those. If you look at the economists who will debate these things about like the impact on wages of Americans, of immigrants, like they vigorously debated and have for over 30 years. But when you look at what like the bounds are, it's like, might low skill workers lose about 8% of their wages or none? And might it last for up to 2 years? Whatever your answer to that question is, I'm not sure it's that important in assessing what would be the right number of immigrants to let into the United States or another country. The question I'm going to play with today is, first of all, I'm going to review briefly, what's the overall economic impact economists think happens, but then say, but what if immigration impacts the institutions that are responsible for our productivity? And if they do that, then the answer to that question can vastly change the debate about the optimal number or mix or style of immigration into a destination country. So first, and this shouldn't be too surprising, but the numbers are probably going to be surprising. By having greater immigration, we vastly increase global income. Part of this is because free trade in labor, and one aspect isn't different than free trade in goods and services. Free trades in goods and services allow us to do what in econ speak would be our comparative advantage, the things that we do relatively cheaper than other people. As a result, and you can't have international trade in some things. I can't outsource my childcare to India, not even here in Texas. I'm pretty sure if I stuck a webcam on them and was like, hey, nanny in India is watching you, someone would be like, yeah, that's probably not childcare. So you actually need to move the laborer to where the service is needed. Similarly, obviously, here in Texas, we know this in agricultural work too. Not all places are equally suited to growing crops, allowing the workers who have a comparative advantage in doing that work to move to where the crops grow can create economic gains. There's a couple big differences in free trade and labor than free trade in goods and services. One of them is obvious is that people aren't like goods and services. A person is not an apple. A person, when they move, can impact the society through formal or informal institutions, norms, beliefs that they'll transmit to others there, in a way that an apple or any other good that was crossing borders will not. And that could impact the gains from immigration. But then on the flip side, another part of this is also one of the greatest predictors of your own productivity is your place. It's not necessarily your own human capital, but where you are. So just imagine yourself with whatever skills and education you have. If we plucked you out of Texas and dropped you in Haiti, would you be able to create as much value for others, to earn as much income if you were in Haiti as if you were here? No. And the same is true of a Haitian that's plucked out of Haiti and dropped in the United States. On average, their income goes up by 1,000%. 1,000% from Haiti. Similar from Nigeria, from Mexico, it's about 150%. Economists talk about this as a place premium. And part of that is because of the laws, the rule of law, the institutions, the economic freedoms. Countries differ. And as a result, human capabilities, what Julian Simon, the economist, called the ultimate resource, human creativity, is better able to make use of its own skills and create value for others in some places than others. So when humans move from one place of the planet to the other, you get the normal gains from free trade, but you also get this big boost in productivity related to them being in an environment where they can make use of their own capabilities more than they could from where they came from. And when economists study this, what they find is it's massive. So I'll go to the bottom on this one. Estimates of if all global barriers to the movement of people went away and we allowed people to migrate, somewhere between 67% to 150% of global output increase. Call it on average a doubling of world GDP. That is jaw-dropping, like pick one economic policy anywhere that could create gains anywhere near as big. You're not going to find one. This is huge. But it's also predicated on the fact that the institutions, norms, formal and informal, in the destination places remain unchanged. If people moving from poorer origin countries that come from places with, let's face it, some dysfunctional socioeconomic systems that don't allow them to make the most of their human potential, if those beliefs migrate with an immigrant and change the destination of change the institutions in the destination country, well then some of those gains go away. If it changed it enough, the gains disappear or even become negative. So to take an extreme example, let's think, so actually to go back to a book that Bob and I wrote about socialism. If Cuban immigrants from Cuba brought not only their human capabilities to the United States, but also brought beliefs of Cuban socialism, and Florida, instead of being one of the most free and open states in the country right now, became the equivalent of socialist Cuba, not only would the immigrants not get the gains of moving to Florida, but existing Floridians would become less productive because now they're working under Cuban institutions. Now, of course, anybody who's at all familiar with this knows that that's not what happens with immigrants from Cuba. In fact, I could probably think of no greater anti-socialist voting bloc in the United States than Cuban immigrants in Florida. But that question remains. Now, is that an outlier or is that a norm? And I think this is a valid question for people concerned with the future of this country and for immigration policy to be concerned with. So what this book does is take that challenge seriously and say, that's something that has a possible impact that could change the game. Because if you're talking about, even if the economists are wrong by a lot on their estimates of this, and it's not a doubling of global GDP, the low bound estimate, call it even 50%. Whatever other problems you come up with immigration, it becomes really hard to figure out, to think about, we couldn't solve this if we were doubling global GDP. If you're global, okay, so there's a fiscal drain, there's a tax drain because of stress on local schools, hospitals, policing, whatever. You've doubled GDP. Could you design public policy in a way that would allocate some of that doubling to address that problem? The answer should be yes. The question here is, if in that very migration that generates those gains, it does something to undermine the institutions that make those gains not happen, well, then that changes the whole game. That's the question we're going to play with here tonight. So there's something called the new economic case for immigration restrictions. And this is basically what they posit. They say that the global gains from migration are big. However, there's going to be something about the immigrants that come, and they're very non-specific about what this is. But something related to the productivity of where they come from that's going to migrate with not just their private human capital that allows them to be more productive, but their social beliefs, how they influence norms, formal and informal institutions. That in econ speak would be an externality, something that spills over to everybody else that lowers their productivity. And if that happens, all of these gains could go away. It's not really that well specified. It could be formal or informal. They've made some models showing how it dissipates. And here he points out, this is George Borjas, who's an economist at Harvard, who's an immigration economist. He's probably the most prominent person making this new case for immigration restrictions. And he says, for immigration to generate substantial global gains, it must be the case that billions of immigrants can move to the industrialized economies without importing the bad institutions that led to the poor economic conditions in source countries in the first place. It seems inconceivable that the North's infrastructure could remain unchanged after the admission of billions of new workers. Then he says, we know little, read nothing, about how host societies would adapt to the entry of perhaps billions of people. And then he writes a theoretical model. What we're going to do in this book is try to examine empirically and say, well, let's look at existing stock and flows of immigrants, how it's impacted institutions. Let's look at some special cases of bigger flows and how that has, and then try to relate it back to this concern. And by the way, while it's a new economic case for immigration restrictions, the basic argument's not that new. And you can trace it back to the founding fathers of the United States and probably before that, but for our purposes, for the United States, this is Thomas Jefferson. Immigrants, quote, will bring with them the principles of the governments they lived, imbibed in their early youth, or if able to throw them off, it will be in exchange for an unbounded licentiousness passing as is usual from one extreme to the another. It'd be a miracle if they were to stop precisely at the point of temperate liberty. You can find Ben Franklin saying things about German immigrants. You can find a lot of this around founding fathers of this concern. What's new about the new economic case for immigration restrictions is it's tied particularly to the institutions related to productivity of the economic gains. But the general idea, this is a conservative, classical, liberal, free market theory in America that runs through our entire history of they might undermine our freedoms. Our freedoms, in this case, that make us more productive, but more generally are coming from less free societies and make us less free ourselves. So here's our contribution. We're going to look at this in cross-country settings, and we're going to look at how it impacts our economic freedom, as any talk at the Bridwell Institute has to talk about economic freedom in some way, shape, or form, although actually really a big chunk of the book is focused on the economic freedoms. But we'll also look at corruption then, rates of terrorism, informal cultural things, at least cultural things as they relate to economic productivity. So we're not talking about immigrants bringing their cuisine here. We're concerned, now this book, by the way, is about international migration, but here with Texas, we're all, especially this last year, as the lockdown states of New York and California and others have been shedding people like crazy, and we've been getting them here in Texas. The fear is that they will bring their beliefs from those states here and make Texas less Texan. The question is whether they would impact our economic and political institutions, not whether they would bring their avocado toast. As long as they bring their avocado toast, they're not in line at barbecue and slowing me down from getting mine. I'm fine with that. If it's undermining our freedoms that we have in Texas, then that's a concern. Now, empirically, we don't look at that part in the book. We don't do interstate migration, but the intuition of what we think about in Texas here is the same intuition we're looking at internationally throughout in this book. Then we're going to look at some case studies where we look at particular flows of mass migration. So not smaller flows across all countries, but some countries that got bigger flows historically in the United States, and then also in Israel and in Jordan in more modern times. So economic freedom first here. Looking cross countries, we're going to look from, and by the way, I should note that a lot of this book I built up over the years of writing scholarly papers with various co-authors. Two of your Bridwell Institute people, Bob and Ryan Murphy, were co-authors on this first study that we did on this, looking at how immigrant stocks and flows impact economic freedom in destination countries. And we looked from 1990 through 2010 of a 20-year flow of immigrants and the initial stock at the starting period. And what does that do to your economic freedom over that 20 years? If you have bigger accumulated stock or a bigger inflow, does it increase, decrease, or not affect your economic freedom in the countries that they move to? Here we're looking at about 110 countries, and countries where the initial stocks range from as small as essentially zero, no immigrants, to as much as 77% of the country was people not born there. Now here's the part that Bob warned you about, regression tables. There's actually 32 individual regressions in this paper that we wrote and in this book chapter. I'm going to show you just one of these tables. By the way, for those not familiar with like economics regression tables, when you see little asterisks, that means this stuff matters. And the more asterisks you see, the more that we're sure it statistically matters. And then the bigger the number that those asterisks are attached to, mean the bigger the oomph of the effect is. When there's an oomph of the effect, I'll try to translate it into normal terms for you so you understand what it is, so it's not just a number with some decimal points. Punchline here of what do we find? Rather than the new economic case for immigration restrictions, that would posit that greater immigrant either stocks or flows or both would have a negative association, that more immigrants coming in or being there would decrease your economic freedoms over a longer period of time. Not only do we not find that, we often find that more immigration is associated with increases in economic freedom. So the story is not that immigrants don't impact your institutions here. It's they do impact it, but not in a negative way, possibly in a positive way. And as we went through, I think, the 32 different things we did in this paper, guys, we didn't find a single case of a negative association that was statistically significant. And in our positive associations, some of them were decently big. So putting it to, translate it into kind of like oomph, in our full specified model, a 1 standard deviation increase in the immigrant stock was associated with about 1/3 of a point bigger in economic freedom index. That's a 1 to 10 point scale. Translate that, unfortunately using one of Bob's other papers, that estimates how much economic freedom impacts growth, ends up being close to a 0.5 percentage point bigger in economic growth per year based on your change in economic freedom. To me, that's a bit of oomph. Now, what we don't do, or what we at least didn't do in this study, or I haven't figured out how to do well, is say, what's the precise channel? Is it because immigrants coming in make the native-born people want less government intervention, more economic freedom, and vote accordingly? Or is it because the immigrants themselves, even though they come from countries with less economic freedom that are poorer, aren't a random sample of the people who move? It's not the pro-Castro immigrants from Cuba who moved to Florida. If it's a kind of selection bias among those who move, maybe they're more pro our freedoms than even our native-born population and push in that direction, even if they can't formally vote right away, but the impact they have. Incidentally, by the way, when it comes to Texas, I wrote a newspaper column about this recently. Actually, I think Dean Stencil in your institute wrote something similar. I think that's a lot of what goes on with in-migration to Texas between states. Yeah, they have their avocado toast and weird things, and I don't like Republican and Democrat as a good proxy for economic freedom because I don't really think they are. But in the idea of like interstate migration turning Texas purple, during the Beto and Cruz election, non-native born Texans voted for Cruz at a higher rate than native born Texans did. Also, when you look at in the self-identifying of Californians who moved to Texas, more of them identify as conservative than liberal. Texas is a thing. You might want to leave California because its property is expensive, your taxes are high, your kids can't go to school forever, whatever it is. But you got 49 other states to move to. If you choose Texas, you're probably not the average Californian. Now, you might go to Colorado, and Colorado's kind of that blend anyway and did it all on its own, and then the extra migration will help it along in its direction. I also think there's something about America. If you're choosing to come to America from other countries, you probably don't hate our freedoms. You might like them, and you might even like them more than the people who grew up with them. That's not the science that's in our numbers here, but that's my intuitive explanation for what I think I'm seeing. And go ahead, I can take some, since we're a relatively small crowd. Bob, we're on for an hour, hour 15. Something like, if I can just blend in questions, I can go the whole time like that.
Economic freedom is core to your discussion. Can you give us a quick definition of what you mean by economic freedom?
Bob, would you like to give the dictionary definition, or you want me to? So when people's justly acquired property is protected and their voluntary exchange of those property titles with others, they are free to do. I would call it economic freedom. That's a pretty sloppy version of it. In terms of his index and what we're measuring here, his 5 big areas, right, is size of government. Bigger government is less economic freedom because they're going to take more of it in taxes and spend for themselves. Protection of private property rights. Your private property rights are protected. Your contracts are upheld. Soundness of money. The government's not distorting the monetary system. You have freedom to use alternative currencies. You have freedom to trade internationally. And you have limited regulation of credit markets, business, or labor markets. There's 45 distinct pieces of data that go into your index. What? 42. 42 now, okay. That's the measure that we're using in this. Thank you. Yeah?
One thing, I think, Bob, tell me if you're wrong, isn't America going down in terms of economic freedom in the last 2 years?
No, we went down and then we're kind of coming back up. It's kind of level.
Okay, now I was saying immigration significantly increased. If economic freedom is going down, does that argue against your point?
Yeah, so possibly, but that's N equals 1. We're doing this right now across 110 countries, but I'm going to do the special case of America a little bit later, and actually the most recent snapshot. So immigration numbers actually were going down during our decline. Well, it's mixed. So the decline in economic freedom is really since 2000 to about 2016, bottoming out, and a little bit of an increase since then. But if you look at migration into the United States, while it was still strong in the early 2000s, the acceleration of the decline in economic freedom got worse post-2008. And post-2008, we didn't have much in-migration because the business cycle killed particularly the Mexican migration disappeared. It doesn't map neatly into it, but I'm going to do like at least 100-year version of this for America in a little bit. Yeah?
I was wondering, taking a look at kind of like a lower end economic integration, we had like these be your lower layers versus your high end, or your software engineer, stuff like that. And then we broke down that, but you see a difference in economic freedom impact.
So this was the first paper empirically investigating this. And so it was our first kind of general look at the data, and then we start cutting it more ways as I go into more papers with other co-authors who are not Bob. But on this one, the closest we come to that is breaking it down between immigrants from OECD and non-OECD countries. So non-OECD. I can full out Vanna White you. Listen, well, not really, but I can jump up on stage. non-OECD ones versus OECD ones, it actually turns out in terms of the impact on economic freedom, the ones coming from the non-club of rich countries are more positively associated with improvements in economic freedom than the richer ones. In the next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about corruption. There we start breaking it down better. And let me do that now. So same thing, basically same exercise we just done with basically the same group of countries, a little bit of variance. In this case, 1995 through 2015, looking at the impact immigration might have on corruption. So you come from poor, corrupt countries. Do you bring that corruption with you into richer destination countries? This is pretty much the exact same thing that we just did. Difference is, what I'll just tell you is, basically no results. There's no relationship from corruption from immigrants from origin countries to destination ones overall. I'll tell you a little story about this too. Girl I went to graduate school with, she was from Russia. She got pulled over. She holds $20 out the window. The police officer, not surprisingly, was not happy. She reached back in her wallet and took out another 20 and said, not enough. I'm sure she did not make this mistake ever again after being in the United States. In some sense, it's a payoff. If corruption pays in an origin country but doesn't pay in a destination country, you drop corrupt practices as you move to a different place. Also, it's the case if you're one of the beneficiaries of the corruption in the origin country, you're less likely to move. If you're one of the people who's exploited by that situation, you're more likely to move. This is first cut at it. We did it a couple different ways then. So this, to your question, we break it out between immigrants from countries that are one standard deviation poorer than whatever their destination is, and one standard deviation more corrupt than what their destination is. Basically, again, don't find any result. And in fact, we play this game again with a whole different data set where you can control for prior trends in corruption in case immigrants are just moving to places that are getting less corrupt anyway. Same non-result, and same non-result again when we break it into lower income, more corrupt. There's basically nothing there as far as we can tell. Next, by the way, I promise now I will, I think I can promise now, like I said, it's the first time I've done this talk publicly, that I won't give you any more regression tables that you all don't want to look at anyway. We'll just do pretty pictures from now. So terrorism, by the way, there were a ton of tables like this in this paper. Punchline. We do two things. One, we say, well, so this was in response to President Trump's ban on immigration from Muslim countries, the travel ban. We said, well, what's the evidence? How much terrorism actually moves with migrants? First one, we quantified what's the economic impact of terrorism in the United States. Punchline, it's a small number in the scope of things because they're rare events, including the value of lives lost, all terrorism since pre-9/11, about $84 billion. Compared to what we just had, a 1.9 so-called stimulus bill, trillion, T, relatively small. But then we look at immigrant stocks and flows again, and we do it, in this case, immigrants overall, but then we separate out immigrants from Muslim majority countries, immigrants from conflict countries. How does that impact terrorism in destination countries, not just the United States, but all destinations, looking at number of people killed in attacks, number of people injured in attacks, or just number of attacks? Is there anything there? Don't find anything. And then, of course, the causality is always a question in all of these things. One of the things we do in this one is say, well, is it just though that, like, so if you're fleeing these countries, do you just go to places that are more peaceful? And we're just picking up on that rather than the effect that you actually have. You could make them more violent. But since you're going to less violent places, it appears that you're not having that impact. So we do something weird. So econ speak, two-stage least squares becomes instrumental variables approach that we do. Econ speak. We're going to use something that predicts future immigrant flows, but can't be the cause of contemporary terrorism. And if we do that, then we can separate out causality better. So diaspora dynamics matter big time in immigration. If you have a bigger prior stock of immigrants from a place, you're going to have a bigger later stock. So we can do the same exercise using immigrant stock circa 1960 to look at terrorism related to immigration in 2000 to 2015, 16, whenever we were finishing up this paper. The immigrant stock in 1960 is mostly dead. They cannot be committing terrorist acts in this later period. Or they're old and very unlikely to. But they are a very good predictor of what future immigrant flows are going to be. So we can use this to untangle it. All right, I can already see the looks I'm getting. Punchline, no relationship. That's the outcome of this. Next one we look at is informal measures of culture. At least culture as related to the productivity, not the avocado toast. So, trust. If immigrants come from societies where there's not a high degree of social trust, do they bring untrustworthy? So the idea that if we're in a more trusting society, well, we need the formal institutions of governance less. If we can do a deal on a handshake, there's lower cost to doing deals than if I think everyone's going to screw me over and we've got to go to the courts every time. Well, if immigrants bring untrusting norms, that might decrease our economic activity, our productivity via this kind of informal channel. Turns out this relationship's really weird. Does trust get you better institutions, or does better institutions generate more trust? When you start parsing out this data, it's not particularly clear. The other thing is that they're substitutable. If you have really crappy court systems, good trust networks substitute for that. If you have better court systems and property rights systems, you don't need as much trust. I remember years ago, Bob, we were at Happy and Hernando de Soto was giving the after dinner talk. He's a Peruvian economist. And he says, in Peru, there's lots of family businesses where we do business with our family members. And, Harvard MBA will come down and study us and be like, oh, isn't it great Peruvians have family businesses? Maybe we need to do more to promote family business there. He's like, no, our courts suck. He's like, so you need to do business with your family because you can't trust other people. He's like, it's a substitute for that. He's like, what we really need is a better court and legal system so that we don't have to do business with our family members. Then he's like, how many of you would like to go into business with your brothers? When everybody laughs, he's like, see the problem? So there's a substitutability between these things, which means even if you bring immigrants from a lower trust norms but to a place with better formal institutions, the importance of the trusting norms matters less, because you don't need to use them as a substitute as much. The other thing that happens is you get, trust assimilation. You came from a place where it made sense not to be trusting. Come to a place where people obey the rule of law better and have better trust norms, well, you start to assimilate to those once you're there. It's also the case that there's a difference between generalized trust, how much can I trust anybody not to screw me over, versus trust in institutions. And it turns out that immigrants actually have more trust in the institutions in the United States, some for better or worse possibly, the reliability of courts, Congress, and the executive branch than native-born Americans do. Even if they have lower trust in generalized trust. My overall assessment is it basically doesn't matter. It's not really clear that much to me how much trust matters for economic growth stuff, and really how much the substitutability is there, and then how much the immigrants impacted. Now we can look at another version of this. So by the way, why did we do trust? Because we can measure it. We have surveys that go across time and places that allow economists to crank out regressions and measure. The other version of doing this is we're not going to actually really measure, so that's a very specific channel. How about other cultural channels that could matter for development? And we're not going to specify a damn one of them, but we're going to look at something related to that. And one of them is called deep roots, where immigrants are from, the cultures they come from. So this is related to a study that was done a little over 10 years ago that looks at the state history and the agricultural history of societies. And the idea was the longer you had a history of organized states and the longer you had settled agriculture, maybe the more you learned how to cooperate in a more advanced society and would be more productive. And then how does that relate to immigration? So obviously a place like the United States, if we just did it by geography, it wouldn't make sense. You have to weight it by the ancestry of the people who live there and where they came from. And they do this and looking at how that affects productivity and says it matters what your ancestry weighted history with both state institutions and settled agriculture has for how productive you are today. Well, then that raises the question of, well, when immigrants come from places that have less of this history to a place that has more, that's going to impact your ancestry-weighted version of this. Might that make you less productive? Well, a few things. One, turns out even if you just read the original study, geography matters way more than this cultural history part. And the geography means moving away from the equator or places that aren't on a coast, places that are not those two things, gets more economic growth than the ancestors. So like the global gain should still be there just based off that study all by itself. The other thing is there's 3 huge outliers in that data set. China, India, and the United States. The 3 most populous countries in the world. If you count Liechtenstein and the United States as equal evidence in this, then you get the result I just told you. If you weight countries by the number of people there, presumably the more people, the more evidence there is, then they actually have no results related to your state history or agricultural history. Even more on this though, I'm not sure how much it speaks to migration. This is talking about, by the way, the state history, this is going back to like your history of state at 1500. Like, what's the evolution of the world since then? How much of that is voluntary migration versus forced colonialization, slave trade, and other, like, that's probably not representative of the marginal impact of immigration from one place to another today. It's just a totally different thing. So this is a way to like do it unspecific, but I don't think it speaks much to migration today. And Ryan Murphy actually has a paper on this using state level stuff in the United States, showing that the same result is when you look at the population histories via US states. All right. Everything so far I've told you has problems. By the way, when I'm going to get done today, I'm going to be like, there is no QED. But I'm going to tell you explicitly at least what I think the problems are here. So one problem that's going to be raised on all of these is endogeneity. Maybe 2 things are going on at once. It's not just the effect that the immigrants have on those things, it's the effect that the immigration, the economic freedoms, the culture, have on immigration. So it's a simultaneous 2-arrow direction of causality going on. So some things that we do mitigate some of this concern, looking at like stocks accumulated over decades versus flows, partly mitigates this. Like when we look at the flow of immigrants over the last 20 years, maybe it's increasing economic freedom attracts more immigrants. Punchline, by the way, yes, it does. But it's not probably the case that like, did the immigrants that came the previous 50 years, that's the accumulated stock at the beginning of the period, did they come because they thought at this last 20 years that was going to increase? That's a little less plausible, but maybe there's persistent trends in improvements of institutions that would still have that story there. So we can do things like controlling for earlier trends. We can do things like that thing we did with the earlier immigration stocks for later terrorism stuff. It doesn't fully alleviate it. But I actually think the bigger concern with all of these is it comes from data on existing stocks and flows of immigrants. We live in a world of managed migration. Now we have big variation in the stocks and flows between countries, but still basically every destination country in the world does things that limits both the quantity and the mix of immigrants that they get. So how valid is this in thinking about what would happen if we allowed way more immigrants in? So it's a question of like moving out of sample then of these managed flows. Well, what would that look like? Part of it is I'm not going to have great data on that because we don't live in that world. Now what we can do is start, if we've got a graph of pick institutional quality of whatever it is that you care about and number of immigrant flow, we can at least get the slope of the line when it's starting. That's what all of these regressions have done. That doesn't tell you if it keeps going up like that or if it bends over. but it's better than just making stuff up, which is essentially what the start of the new case for immigration restrictions was doing, was saying they might impact productivity, and if they impact it this bad, it could be this bad. I can write a math model that does that. In fact, that's what they did, but they gave no evidence. So getting the first part of that line is something, unlike the nothing that I quoted at the beginning. So now what I'm going to do is start looking at places that have different versions of bigger mass flows of migration that aren't the average across a bunch of countries, but instead we're going to look at single countries with big flows. So obviously is United States. It's cliche to say it's a nation of immigrants, but it is. And we had essentially unrestricted migration in the quantitative sense until, other than the Chinese Exclusion Acts, until the early 1920s. So how did that impact the evolution of economic freedom or other institutions of the United States? Put up two big free market economists, Marx and Engels, who actually wrote about the effect of immigration on the United States and institutions. Unlike some of the founding fathers' fears, if you read their letters about this, they bemoan the fact that constant immigration to the United States is prohibiting the advancement of socialism in the United States, unlike European countries, primarily through undermining unionization in the late 19th century. Because as you allow more and more workers in, it's harder to have worker solidarity in the union movement, and the union movements were the big push for socialism or social democracy in the European countries. You weren't getting that in the United States. Instead, you had heterogeneous immigrants coming in and replacing one immigrant group with another immigrant group in the factory, and thus undermining the power of unions that were a force for bigger government and anti-economic freedom. To my knowledge, this is the only work that I favorably quote Karl Marx in. Second thing that's happening, native-born population tends to look less favorably on the welfare state. This is true today when we look at other countries as well, but it was also true in the United States back then. Blonde, blue-eyed Swedes are more tolerant of welfare states for other blonde, blue-eyed Swedes than they are for people who look different. Whether right or wrong, that's something that exists. But to the extent that bigger taxes and a bigger welfare state are an infringement upon economic freedom, having a more heterogeneous population is one way to limit the domestic population's desire for less economic freedom and a bigger welfare state. We can also look at federal and state tax expenditures, and local tax rates in the United States as it relates to immigration. So just think about, by the way, if we think about the large pitch of like size of government in the United States, when's the big era of the biggest growth of government in the United States? World War II is part of that era. Starts before that. New Deal, World War II, into the Great Society, right? What's the era of most closed migration in the United States? 1920 to 1965. 1920, 21, we get the acts that basically closed legal migration to the United States. It's not till 1965 that you get the immigration reform that significantly increases immigrant flows again. Prior to that time period, we had basically unrestricted migration to the United States. That's the era of smallest government growth in the United States. Since then, government has grown again, but not as rapidly as in that closed time. Here's a couple of charts on it. So, orange line is the immigrant stock as a percent of the population in the country. Blue line is federal expenditures. You'll see, here we are in the so that's World War I. So then 1920s through about 65 here, if we're going to trend line this, biggest increase in expenditures, also the time while immigration stock is going lowest, recovery after that, immigrant stock going up. Federal government size continues to go up, but at a less steep rate than before. We can also do the same with fractionalization, ethnic fractionalization in the United States, and growth in federal expenditures. That's federal outlays as a percent of GDP, similarly. Not definitive, but indicative. Now, by the way, there's also going to be problems with each of these examples that I give you for generalizing. Part of that is the United States experience with open immigration. Was it an earlier era? It was 100 years ago. couple modern examples. So Israel in the 1990s. So Israel has a weird immigration policy, and they've had it, by the way, I should say, the first paper I wrote with Bob and Ryan on this, the economic freedom one, I sent it to the lead guy who's like most interested in the new case for economic restrictions for immigration. He wrote me back, he's like, I would like to see a large exogenous immigration flow and what that does to institutions. And as I'm like reading his email, I'm like, Israel, 1990s, but it's a place that had a version, and I say a version, of open immigration who didn't change their policy. That's what he means by exogenous. But something else changed that radically changed the number of immigrants coming in. So Israel's had the law of return basically since its founding, which says all worldwide Jewish people, their children, their non-Jewish spouses, and the non-Jewish spouses of children and grandchildren can all migrate to Israel, and as soon as they get off the plane, have instant citizenship and voting rights, access to welfare states. So that's why they call it the law of return. The Soviet Union had emigration restrictions. It wouldn't let you out of the country. At the fall of the Soviet Union, their emigration restrictions go away. There's a huge Jewish population, or people descended from people who are religiously Jewish in the Soviet Union, who want to get the hell out of Dodge. And a lot of them move to Israel. So this graph on the left gives you the annual migration as a percent of the population. And the orange line tells you the percent from former Soviet Union countries. Over the course of the 1990s, Israel's population increased 20% from migration from the former Soviet Union. That's a mass migration. It's a mass migration from a country that had a 70-year history of no political freedoms and very limited economic freedoms. If they brought those norms with them, it could impact Israel's institutions. Obvious thing someone brings up. Dude, it's Israel. That's kind of different. They were all moving there to be part of the Zionist project or whatever. Well, actually, no. So as painful as it is, if you read Sociologist, which I did to study this question of like, what are the people like who are involved in this movement? Turns out that 3/4 of them are secular. They're not religiously Jewish at all. They have no interest in Israel as a Zionist project. Very few of them are traditionally religious. About half of them wish they could go somewhere else. They just didn't because they didn't have the legal right to. Most of them spoke Russian, 97% spoke Russian, but only like 15%, less than 15%, spoke a Jewish language. So they weren't religiously and linguistically homogeneous with the place that they were moving to. Most of them, if you read what they felt nostalgia for Russia, Russian culture, you see an explosion of Russian language newspapers and media, other media sources in Israel at this time. They weren't going there to be part of the Israel project. They were going there for normal push motives. They were in a place without much economic opportunity. They wanted to go to a place with more economic opportunity. They are a little bit different, or one margin at least, that they're different than mass migrations from poorer countries, is they were educated. Most of them had a reasonable education on the level of the middle class people in Israel, so that type of human capital was different, although they often couldn't use it. Same type of thing you see with taxi cab drivers here or whatever, where you have people who have a doctorate in their home country but can't use it in their destination country. But they were educated, which is different than mass migration from poorer countries to richer countries today. So what do we see? First thing I did when I got this email, I'm like, duh, Israel. Next, Google economic freedom of the world. Go to Bob's website or Fraser Institute's website that's hosting it and look at what just happened in raw freedom score in Israel. Well, there you go. You can see the red line's what was happening to the global average. The blue line, Israel, was not very high in economic freedom. Turns out they improved their economic freedom a huge amount in the 1990s. So they go up 45%. They go from 15% below the global average to 12% above. In terms of rankings, they go from 92nd out of, at that point, probably about 130, 140 countries, up to 45th. That's just the raw numbers. And then next thing to look at was what happened about the individual. So I mentioned when you asked how we talk about economic freedom or measure it before, across these 5 components, 4 out of the 5 show a big improvement over this time. 1 does not. size of government. But it's not because the institutions changed. The Russians didn't come there and vote a bigger size of government. It's about how Bob's index measures it. So transfers are a component of it. A whole bunch of them came in. They have immediate welfare state access, so they have transfer benefits. Transfer benefits in money terms go up. Economic freedom score goes down. The rules of transfer didn't change, just the numbers did. As a result, as they economically assimilate, that score improves so that by 2005, after the mass migration is all over, they're basically back up to where they started on that. So economic freedom overall improves, 4 out of 5 improve. The one that doesn't, it's not that the rules changed, the immigrants didn't come and make those worse, it's just the amount of transfer was changing. So what we try to do on this one is try to figure out what's the causal effect then of the immigrants coming. And we do this in a different statistical way. So the ideal thing, like all social experiments, if you had, well, it'd be bad for humanity, but it'd be good for social science. If all of social scientists had North and South Koreas to compare, where you have like a country with like one history, one people, one language, one culture, and you give one like one system, one another system, and then see how they evolve, you can start to parse out like, well, what's the effect of the difference of those systems? We don't have that in most places. What we'd really want to evaluate Israel is like, I'd like to see an Israel that gets a mass migration and an Israel that doesn't get a mass migration, and what's the difference between the two? So synthetic control is a statistical way that we can do that in economics and social science. You can think of it as basically creating fake Israel and real Israel, and then comparing how they do against each other. And to create fake Israel, since we don't have a North and South Korea, we're going to use a weighted average of a bunch of countries that were similar to Israel, and we're going to weight it such that statistically they act like the evolution of the institutions in Israel prior to getting the mass migration. So that's everything to the left of this line, where you get the real Israel, the dark line, the dotted line, and that weighted average basically follows each other. But then we let that algorithm go at 1990 and say what happens to the real one versus the weighted average. You can see the divergence. The real one becomes way more economically free. The predicted path of the other one never gets there. And then we can do some little games to see like how this stands up to messing around with how we do it. So we can move the date back and just say, well, maybe it's just like that weighted average can't predict the one afterwards. So we can move it earlier, 1985. And if the two just diverge, then it says, well, it's just not a good predictor. Well, now they continue to stay the same until 1990, and then they get the divergence at the immigration wave. We can also take every country that we were using to possibly construct the weighted average and see how it does in this. This big fat line up here, that's the Israel one, the one that's way outside everybody else. That means using a weighted average to make a prediction for everybody else stays way more in line with how they actually do than Israel. Israel's the weird outlier, telling you there's something odd happening there. So then next is like, what's the mechanism? How is this happening? And honestly, I can use like these fancy statistical techniques, but sometimes the evidence is just very plain. So you had a balance of power between the right-leaning party and the Labor Party. When the Russian immigrants come in, the Labor Party ceases using the color red in their political propaganda because they don't want to alienate the Russian vote. If the Russians wanted to come in and recreate Soviet socialism, this would not be true. We can look at their political participation rights, the formation of Russian parties that become part of the coalition governments during this time. Basically, they were a pro-market force in Israel in the 1990s that took a place that was at a political equilibrium that was pretty balanced between the two and pushed it in a more pro-market direction. I'll spare you some slides, tell you we did something similar for Jordan. So in their case, it's about a 10% increase in the population from a mass flow of immigrants. That mass flow of immigrants comes from Gulf War #1, when Palestinians from Kuwait flee Kuwait, come into Jordan, also have instant citizenship and can impact institutions. They are not part of the group that is in control of government there. They're the more entrepreneurial class. They are not getting jobs in the state sector. They become a force lobbying for liberalization of business so that they can be employed and be part of business. we do a similar exercise. That blue line's the real Jordan. The other lines are those fake Jordans that we use. We create them a couple different ways and find Jordan's economic freedom also improves from mass migration. So, limitations on each of these. There's problems with all of these. So, one, United States, that's free migration in early 19th and early 20th century. Communication, travel, more difficult than today. And we had a smaller role of government overall that immigrants were coming into at that time. Israel and Jordan, they're both unique mass immigrant flows. It didn't apply to everybody. It was like free migration for some people, no migration for others. Really what we do is we take the concerns about endogeneity and small flows and manage migration, and we replace them with concerns about external validity. How much does the case of any one of these three tell us about the United States having unlimited migration today? What we're building towards, though, here is trying to empirically assess the merits of this claim that they're going to destroy our institutions, our freedoms that make us productive. And ultimately, it's an empirical claim that's been made, and it requires evidence. Nobody who's made that has given empirical evidence. I went around looking for it, haven't found it. None of my answers are ironclad. It doesn't mean there's not some bilateral flow from one country to another country that wouldn't undermine their freedoms, wouldn't lower their productivity. But we've looked across a broad set of countries. We don't find it in the more limited numbers. The cases we can get of mass migration, we don't find it there. So this should make us skeptical of how relevant this is until given evidence that it's actually occurring. Next step is, if we did find evidence that such an externality was present, what would that do to migration policy? The non-thinking answer is, we'd close the border, we'd cut it down. That's not actually how you address, this is an economics problem about an externality. What you'd do is you'd address it most directly while securing as much of the gains from immigration as you could get. So let's think about free trade. So economists overwhelmingly, and since the time of Adam Smith, have known free trade in goods and services is generally going to promote the welfare of everybody involved, or the welfare of society overall. But you could have a national defense exception. So something where having free trade in it imperils our national security, so therefore we shouldn't have free trade in that. Note, when you have that exception, that doesn't equal, because, to use a bad and recently invoked example in the United States, a national security exemption for steel, that doesn't mean therefore we should abandon free trade in everything. It's just in steel. And just because one country has that doesn't mean all countries have that. So if we took, Bob's a big fan of South Africa, if we took Lesotho, which is like a landlocked country inside, entirely surrounded by South Africa, and they come up with some goods that they have, that they need for national security, that they shouldn't have free trade in, that same basket of goods does not apply to the United States. We have two oceans. If we cannot have international trade and things coming across both those oceans, we probably have a problem bigger than whatever the free trade concern was with this. So it's going to be specific to the country, and it's going to be specific to the good. Well, we should think about the immigration via this, how they impact our institutions, the same way. If we found some evidence of it, it would be a reason to restrict the quantity or quality of immigrants from a particular origin to a particular destination. And that wouldn't necessarily apply to all destinations, but only to the one where that's happening. So, by the way, I'm about to give you an example, and I want to be clear. I do not believe that such a negative externality exists in either of these cases right now. I'm using this for illustrative purposes. In the United States, we have lots of immigration from Latin America. Europe has very little migration from Latin America. If Latin Americans were bringing norms from their origin countries that were undermining productivity in the United States, if the United States had a case for limiting immigration from Latin American countries, either in quantity or the type of immigrant that they admit, that would say nothing about what they should do for immigration from Southeast Asia or from Middle East, North Africa. Meanwhile, Europe has almost no Latin American migration, but has a lot of migration from Middle East, North Africa. If Europe is having a hard time maintaining its institutions that are responsible for productivity in response to immigration from Middle East and North Africa, they would have a reason to quantitatively restrict that, or qualitatively, but not Latin America. Meanwhile, the United States has very small numbers of migration from Middle East, North Africa. If both use their own selective exempt, it would change the pattern of where destinations are, but total number of people moving would be about the same. And because the productivity of Europe relative to those origins and the United States relative to, is not quite the same, but relatively close, the global gains would be pretty close to the same too. So you could deal with this externality, if this externality is shown to exist, you can deal with it in ways that aren't blanket immigration restrictions. They're selective interventions against free migration with a norm of free migration. And I was using only those two to just kind of illustrate that idea. So I also would end with, if trying to implement that policy, all of this is done in the world of real politics. It's most likely going to be the case, just like steel tariffs were invoked because of national defense reasons. Listen, we get steel from Canada, Germany, Asia, Mexico. It comes from all directions. There's no national security reason for a trade exemption for that. It's just being invoked that way. Standard public choice reason is going to apply in this case too. As soon as you start doing it, you're going to get immigration restrictions that are said for this reason that really have nothing to do with it. And if that's the case, maybe the norm of free trade, or free migration, just like free trade, is the better way to go, even if there is a negative externality. But I'm at least willing to entertain the idea of how would you deal with it if it did exist, but I don't find evidence that it does. And I take it seriously because as someone who values our institutions of economic freedom, if immigrants really did undermine economic freedom in the United States by coming here, I would revise the amount of that I'm favorable on immigrants coming in. So this isn't the left-leaning pro-immigrant talk that you'd get from other people. It's one who recognizes this basic conservative classical liberal fear, agrees with it in theory, but says I haven't seen evidence for it. If I saw evidence for it, I'd revise my position, but I don't. Therefore, people who are otherwise free market, I think, should be more pro-immigration. With that, I will conclude and take any remaining questions. Thank you.
Ben, you're a tenured university professor. I should let you handle the room yourself. But you also know we have dinner reservations shortly after.
As a tenured university professor, I won't do my grading and I'll leave the room now. Yeah.
Washington, D.C. is debating a massive tax change coming up, and I was wondering what your feeling is on that as it relates to economic freedom. It's only going to affect a small percentage of the population. Maybe it's not an issue, but that percentage of the population are the folks that create the jobs. And as part of that, they're looking at hourly wages, and I was wondering, we live in a global economy. How's that going to affect manufacturing? Is manufacturing jobs going to go to the local cost provider, Mexico, Vietnam, China, if they raise the minimum wage?
All right, so like a good tenured university professor, I'm going to take that and use it however I want to talk about stuff. So I agree with the general sentiment you expressed at the beginning of this. I think it's a bad thing that this tax increase, I think it will lower economic growth as well as probably be unjust to those who it's being imposed on, which may or may not be me. I haven't read the details close enough yet. But when it comes to I want to bring up this point about thinking about, because you brought up the jobs in East Asia or Latin America. I grew up in Haverhill, Massachusetts. Bob said I did my undergrad at UMass Lowell, the heart of the Industrial Revolution. When we had an era of free migration in the United States, factories didn't move, workers moved to factories. So those Lowell factories in the 1830s and 1840s employed women who were leaving farms. Those women became more productive and had a higher opportunity cost. They get replaced with Irish immigrants. When Irish immigrants came in and became more productive, they get replaced with Southern European and Eastern European immigrants over time. until we get to the 1920s. So each time, like we think of shifting comparative advantage in economics, the immigrants moved to where the factories were. The immigrants who had a comparative advantage moved to where the factories were. Once we close immigration in the United States, the immigrants can't move to the factories must move to the workers. So this process is slow in the 1930s, where you have your Great Depression, but post-World War II, it starts moving to the East Asian, what became the East Asian tigers, right? Hong Kong, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Japan. Japan's a little weird one because they were industrialized and decimated, but all of the other ones were pre-industrial economies that then grew. And then they moved from there to Vietnam, to China, to Bangladesh, to various Latin American countries. Free trade in goods and free trade in labor on the margin are substitutes for each other. When you have free trade in labor, more workers move to factories. When you don't have free trade in labor, more factories move to workers. It's not a one-for-one, but these things are substitutes on the margin. A point I didn't bring up before and wasn't really in your question, but just how I wanted to use it. Thanks. Yeah?
Does anything in your model change when it's unaccompanied children and children who are migrating without parents, so therefore not necessarily bringing future skills, but at a time requiring services, to protect them while they're immigrating, while we wait for them to mature to adulthood?
Yeah. So I didn't talk about fiscal impact on this. If I was doing my normal public immigration talk, I would. So overall, the fiscal impact of there's lots of, by the way, if you Google tax burden or fiscal impact, you can find studies that'll tell you anything you want. That they're a huge tax drain, that they're a huge tax drain, because it's really easy to cook the books on these studies. So the simple and obvious way to do it is you add up the tax dollars an immigrant pays and the services they consume, and then you get a number. It's simple, but it's wrong. For the same reason, if you did the same bill for my kid who attends Preston Smith Elementary in Lubbock, he generates a little sales tax revenue, I guess, but basically he's a welfare queen, right? He goes to a government school. He's a net tax, but we all know that's not the right way to do them. What we need is what's going to be his earnings over time, and what's his upfront cost in education, and then what do we expect if Social Security exists when he retires? What's his Social Security burden? And then discount that all back to present values, and then we get how he impacts it. But Arnie, note what I did. I said, if Social Security still exists when he retired, what you make about future tax and spending assumptions of the government 50 years out, 70 years out, you can cook the books backwards on this. And people do. That's why you can get these studies. Conceptually, it's the right way to do it. But most of the reasonable ones just say, if we project current fiscal policy out into the future, what is it? And the punchline is, immigrants overall are a slight net tax gain, but you can find studies that are reasonable that make them a slight net tax burden. But when you split it out, young working immigrants, even who are uneducated, are a gain. The real burdens are older, unskilled ones who aren't going to work for very long once they get here. The children coming in probably depends on I'd have to be a little bit careful about which ones I want to parse out, but they're probably net tax gains. But in terms of the institutional stuff I'm thinking about in this, I do think there is a problem, I don't know about a problem, a challenge in America of educating young people in the values that make America great and made it great. And that's true whether the young people are native born or foreign. And I'm not sure our schools do a good job of that either way. And that's how it would translate into the type of stuff I'm talking about here. But I'm not particularly worried about unaccompanied minor children from a fiscal standpoint. If there are particular drains, they're going to be localized, relatively small and temporary. Since they're coming young, there'll be a fiscal gain overall eventually. And I'm not sure they're going to be any worse than the native-born children who go into the same educational things as they are. To the extent there's a problem, I think it's our education system, not necessarily the immigrant or non-immigrant on the children. Yeah.
What is your definition of immigrant? Is it all immigrants or is it legal immigration? And how do I live at the edge of Dallas. I lived in Highland Park for 26 years and went to SMU. I see a direct impact of property taxes, people who have to leave their homes because they can no longer afford the property taxes because I have a DISD school that is funding paying
repeat
a
the
lot of
question,
money
Ben?
to fund for illegal immigrants. So how does all of your information compare when someone has a personal impact or can see something? Are we just slanted in that? Are we only looking at certain factors? Does that play a part?
Okay, so great question, and it's to semi-repeat as asked, the difference between legal and illegal immigration flows, and then particularly its impact on local jurisdictions, tax burden, real estate and financing schools and other things. I think it's a great question. You'll notice at no point tonight did I talk about legal versus illegal immigration. I just talked about immigrant flows. And part of that's baked into the, if immigrants don't destroy our institutions, the policy should be legal immigration, which means there is no illegal immigration. Before 1921, other than the Chinese Exclusion Act, we didn't have illegal immigration because it was legal to immigrate. Now you had quarantine, Ellis Island checks and stuff like that. I don't use the phrase open borders on purpose because I don't want people to assume that it means willy-nilly anybody can jump across the Rio. I mean, come through legal checkpoints, have whatever safety checks, criminal background checks you want, but no blanket quantitative restrictions. That's why I don't use the legal versus illegal. When it comes to the specific spot about what you're observing about schools and tax burden, entirely right. So sometimes an anecdote is not the same as the overall data, but the anecdote that you're pointing out does bear out in the data. When you look at the fiscal impact on governments, even when the net impact of immigration is positive overall, it tends to be in local jurisdictions. You can have local tax drains on the existing population, particularly through schools, hospital, policing, where a disproportionate amount of the tax revenue generated by the immigrants goes to the federal level, and the local burden is a net negative. Now, to me, that's not a problem of immigration per se. It's a problem of how we do public policy that makes immigration a drain for a community. Like the stuff I showed you on the very second slide about global gains, like if the pie gets bigger and a lot bigger, there's no reason we have to create drains. Policy in dealing with immigration, not immigration per se. If immigration, and what I've been trying to address in this talk is, if immigration did something to the institutions that made the pie smaller, then we're all worse off and we should address it. If the pie's getting bigger, we can find these negative things, but if we're smart about it, we should be able to figure out a way to make those gains too. So you're spot on with what you're identifying. Yeah?
You talked about the pie getting bigger, roughly 0.5% increase in GDP, but the cost of that to the taxpayers, you didn't express that as an equation. You did express it up through the 20s, we were underneath many services, and they were on their own. People were on their own. That's not true today.
Yep. So part of it's the existing evidence, but I'm fully willing to entertain the idea that if we allowed lots more low-skilled immigrants into the country, the tax burden would become a fiscal drain instead of a fiscal gain, even though the pie's getting much bigger. To me, there's like obvious ways that this would be addressed. So if we identified such a drain, we could say, close the border. Or we could say, let them in, but let's do something that makes them a gain. So I think I quoted Haitians earlier, if the average Haitian goes 1,000% increase in income, how about we put a 10% by the way, not my favorite policy, but playing with ideas here, we put a 10% surtax on all immigrants to the United States. 10% of their income, they have to pay an immigrant surtax, regardless of what their personal income taxes bracket would be otherwise, no minimums, no exemptions. Some will be poor and not pay very much, but others will create companies and pay tons. And then your average Haitian, instead of 1,000%, their income goes up 990%. My guess is that's not going to impact the number who would come very much, and we could take that surtax and apply it to the school districts or wherever the fiscal drain is, and deal with and by the way, 10%, I just made up that number. Maybe it's 5%, maybe it's 20%. We could also use auctioning permits as a way to do this, because just like international trade, right? Tariffs are a tax, quotas are a quantity limit, but in one you control price and you influence quantity, the other you control quantity and you influence price. My intuition is it would be better to do it with the tax on if one were going to do this, to do it on a tax rather than a quota, just because of income constraints. An immigrant can come in and pay a higher tax for most of their big earnings come after they move, so it's really hard to pay that up front. Maybe capital markets could adjust to make loans to them, but maybe that's problematic in a way that student loans are problematic. So my intuition is that the tax way would be a better way to do it. But this is it's solvable without a lot of creativity. In fact, by the way, in terms of ethical systems and thinking about this, I think you could be a thoroughgoing nativist who says, I could give a damn about the welfare of anybody not born in the United States, and listen to my talk and say, is there a way I can make people in the US richer from immigration? Yes, let more of them in, tax the hell out of them, give that money to native-born citizens. If you're talking doubling global GDP, there's a lot you can do with doubling world income. Yeah. Last one, okay.
Thinking back to when you launched into these studies, any major surprises in what you found, that you weren't expecting?
Honestly, the first one that we did together, Bob, on economic freedom, I was expecting a no result. I expected immigrants to have no effect on economic freedom in destination countries, and we actually got the opposite, that it's positively affected, which caused me to think more about positive selection bias of who comes, that they're not representative of their native population. How much in the end I believe that they improve it? I'm really confident that they're not destroying it. I'm less confident in how much they naturally improve it. But that was actually which, by the way, when you start out to do an economic study that you're going to publish in a journal and you expect a no result, most of the time when you get no results on empirical investigations, it equals no publication. But we were starting this with there's an important objection, and a lot of people intuitively believe it. Actually, if we investigate it and we don't find any result, that in and of itself is important. So I guess that part was a little bit surprising to me, and it was the first one. I was less surprised when I got some of this out of later ones. With that, thank you all for having me back. Appreciate you.